Good evening. This is the June edition of Operation City on the Hill. I'm your host, Robert Maynard. The title of tonight's show is going to be America's Covenant, a Holy Experiment in Laissez-Faire. And this is going to be the first in a series on American Conservatism, and it's going to explore a theme about how American conservatism went off track, which, in my opinion, has went off track. And in order to figure out how it went off track, you have to what is the heart of conservatism that it should have been on, and ideally. So that's the theme that I'm going to express. My contention is there are many different elements in settling America, but the one that gave birth to the notion that was expressed in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and was later immortalized in the Statue of Liberty, is a certain trend that goes back to the early pilgrims who came here to the shores of New England, and they saw themselves as establishing a city on a hill. And a city on a hill is a phrase that was immortalized in John Winthrop's speech or sermon that he gave in 1630. I think it was aboard I forget the name of the ship. They were heading towards the Boston colony. Boston Harbor. And he gave this famous sermon, A City on a Hill, and the sermon was entitled A Model of Christian Charity, and he starts talking about the covenant of America's covenant with God. And the covenant is the terms of a relationship. You can have the relationship between the individual and God, between a group of people and God, between the people themselves. And so this is terms of a relationship. The terms of this relationship was seen as a covenant going back to the Jewish notion and then the Christian notion. And the essential part of that covenant was human freedom, the dignity of the human person and the freedom of the human person, as opposed to fatalism and humans merely being a speck in this vast cosmic drama. Now, I've talked about this before. For a lot of human history, humans were seen as a speck in this vast cosmic drama, and that the notion that justice is the advantage of the stronger was a very popular theme. And why not? You know, there's nothing special about human beings. It's like the gazelle doesn't complain when the lion eats it, or doesn't. It's natural. It's in their nature. It probably does complain, but no one's going to listen to it. No one expects it to be any different than that. And so, are human beings part of the same drama, the law of the jungle? And there is a tradition within the there is a tradition that goes back all the way back to the notion that God created human beings in his image. So there's a certain dignity of the human person. And the ability to enter into a covenant with a transcendent being is where the notion of freedom comes from. Because we're conditioned in B.F. Skinner once said that it is, if you take in order to apply the laws of the scientific method to human behavior, you have to assume that human beings are not free. So in terms of the phenomena, the world of phenomena, the natural world, intellectually it's not really feasible to postulate human freedom because we're at the mercy of forces beyond our control. And one time Abraham Heschel, he wrote this piece called God in Search of Man, the Philosophy of Judaism. And he's saying that human freedom is theoretically not possible unless you assume the religious notion that human beings are able to transcend their condition of being a phenomena of nature and enter into a relationship with a transcendent reality. And that's what the essential premise of religion. And particularly, I consider this premise to be more clear in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So the essence of this transcendent ability, which comes with that ability to enter into a covenant with a transcendent being, is where the notion of freedom comes from. And there is a series of articles that was written by Lord Acton. He was a British historian. One of them was called The History of Freedom in Antiquity. And he talked about the ancient Greeks and the city-states of ancient Greeks and democracy and the Republic of Rome and all these. But at the beginning, he talks about the ancient Jews who came out of Egypt and went into Canaan, and they created this federation, a tribal federation based on families. And there was no state at that time holding them together. They were held together by this covenant, the laws of God, and you didn't have a police force holding it together. So yeah, they would enforce it, but they enforced it themselves. And he was, Lord Acton explaining that this was the most purest example in the ancient terms of human freedom. And this was the example. They came out of Egypt where they were ruled by a tyrant, the Pharaoh. And they came into Canaan, and they entered into a covenant where they were split up into these tribal federations, and the rule over them was not legalistic because there was no police force to enforce it. They could reject or accept the rule of these judges. These judges would, during the time of the wilderness time, they were patriarchs. But they didn't have any legal authority to rule over the people. They had spiritual influence. And so Moses came together in this covenant. Okay, these are the laws in order to guide society. So the covenant was based upon the law. And they were looking forward to a time when God would create a new covenant with them and write his law in their hearts, so they wouldn't even need to have an external law, that it would all be within. And that was what Christians believe. The new covenant. The old covenant was a covenant of law. The new covenant was a covenant of love. And ideally, you wouldn't have human beings ruling over another human beings. God would rule directly in the human heart. And so you'd have even more freedom. So this is a theoretical ideal. Of course, the practical application of this ideal doesn't necessarily work. Augustine, who was a big influence on the Puritans and the settlers of Fuskim over here. As a matter of fact, a lot of people have made this argument that Augustine should be considered an honorary founder of America because of his influence on the American institutions through the Puritans and through people like Jonathan Edwards, who combined the influence of the Enlightenment with the Awakening and made a vision and education system that was very holistic in terms of religious beliefs and intellectual pursuit, something we don't see this unity today, but it was the freedom of the human person was a big part of it. Now, in practice, they didn't always practice what they preached. You have all kinds of problems in practice, but in theory, the theory was sound, and it was a basis for the later abolitionist movement. And you had the most probably, and I'm going to go into this is where the laissez-faire comes from. It means leave us alone, which is like associated with libertarianism, but it's really brought its fullest fruition in early America came from the Quakers' experiment. A holy experiment in laissez-faire is the Quakers' experiment in laissez-faire, who was living out this covenant to its most, tried to live out this covenant to its most practical implications. And William Penn founded the colony of Pennsylvania, and they created the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, based upon this notion. So I'm going to go into this a little bit later, but I want to talk about the notion of one human being ruling over another. Throughout most of human history, that was considered natural. The strong, some people are born to rule, some people are born to re-rule, as Aristotle said. And even before that, the rule of the jungle, justice is the advantage of the stronger. So the idea that one person or a group of people should rule over another was considered normal and natural. Augustine addressed this in one of his writings when he started talking about, he was referring to the Genesis account. God gave man dominion over creation. In other words, like a garden, like a gardener gardens, takes care of his garden. That dominion is to be one of stewardship. So in order to take care of the garden, you have to have a certain capability that sets you apart from the garden. You can't expect the plant to take care of the rest of the garden, and it's just not going to happen. So the image of the garden, where God was saying he planted the garden and he didn't have a man to till it or to take care of it, is an image of stewardship. And so sometimes we understand this, and you have this image of exploitation. And that's, unfortunately, a misunderstanding of it. And according to the Quakers and Puritans and a bunch of others, the exploitation came in because of a perversion of the notion of dominion. There's a corruption, became a corruption in human nature when humans failed to realize these ideals. But so Augustine was talking about this in the City of God, that famous book that he wrote, a huge book. And he's talking about God gave man dominion over nature, a rational being, dominion over irrational nature. It's more, it grows instinctively, and it doesn't have to operate according to reason. And the rational capability gives man the ability to cultivate the garden and bring out the best in it. So he said, but he did not give man dominion over other men, rational beings dominion over other irrational beings. We have government and we have the rule of one group of people over another simply because you had a corruption of human nature. So his purpose of rule is to keep us in check so we don't to keep the evildoers in check so they don't violate the rights of the innocent. Ideally, that's the purpose of government, according to St. Paul, and that's what Augustine was picking up on. Unfortunately, people were saying, no, actually, government is built on conquest, and instead of protecting the innocent from the evildoer, it empowers the evildoer to oppress the innocent. And so there's this, within the American exploration, now I'm going to go back to Winthrop's sermon. He's talking about this covenant, and he's referring to the individual covenant with God, and he refers to Adam and his original covenant with God. And the term Adam has, I believe, two connotations. One connotation is the male of the species. You got Adam and Eve, male and female. But the other is the human person. There is a Jewish mystical tradition where it talks about Adam Kadama, which is almost like Plato's form of the perfect person, the perfect human being. This is human beings in ideal. It's not probably in the mind of God, like Plato's forms. And then so when you have it in reality, you have male and female, and you have Greek and in Christianity, in the Bible, in St. Paul, in several places, says, in Christ there is no Greek or Jew or male or female. He's talking about the pure essence of humanity. And that's, we're all one in Christ Jesus. So what he's talking about there is that, and this is, all men are created equal. And the Bible says, when in the Declaration of Independence talk about all men are created equal, they're talking about human beings in the sense of the human species, man as not the male of the species. So therefore, your rights includes different racial groups, male and females. There's gender differences. So this understanding makes it unnecessary to create protected groups to protect them, because you can divide Americans into all kinds of groups. And nowadays you have, we have rights based upon race, we have rights based upon gender, we have rights based upon all kinds of things. They keep multiplying, and it's confusing. And this is part of the problem, is because we're not looking at human beings as a personhood. What is the essence of human personhood? And regardless of what type of person you become, you have basic rights. And so this is part of this idea of covenant, that the human person, whether they be male or female or black or white or Hispanic or all these different varieties of personality of human persons that developed as time went on, you're still a person. And so this is, in essence, this covenant deals with the individuality of the human person and personhood of the person, regardless of whether male, female, or black or white, or race or gender. Is the foundation of the covenant. Because the human being is capable of entering into a covenant with a transcendent being, we have freedom. And so that destiny that we have is tied up with this transcendent experience. And therefore, no state or group of people or other people can determine that destiny. That destiny is determined by a relationship with this transcendent being. So humans essentially must have freedom. So the question, and that's the beginning of the covenant. So you got this beginning, you got this covenant with Adam and the Creator. And it's a covenant based upon love. So you got this old covenant is based on law. And they were saying the new covenant is going to be, I'm going to write the law in your heart. You're going to be based upon love. And that's what John Winthrop was talking about in this. What is the relationship? What is the blood and muscle and tissue that hold the body together? And he's talking about the body of human beings, human society. And after the corruption of human nature and the falling away of this ideal, from this ideal, you have an attempt to restore this ideal through what the Christians call the body of Christ. What is the relationship that brings us together? It's one based upon love. He's just opposing that to the old covenant was one based upon law, as opposed to force, might makes right, racial distinctions, your blood lineage. There's all kinds of things that held a people together. Blood and soil. You come from a certain place, you're of a certain lineage, and these are the old ways of thinking. And going back to Augustine now, and he was talking about in City of God, he's talking about government has this sole role to prevent the evildoers from this, picking up on St. Paul's, from doing harm to the innocent. Now, during the Middle Ages, there was a time when, after the Roman civilization broke down, you had complete chaos, and you have these barbarians from the north, they're coming down on civilization. You got a rebuilding of civilization going on in the church. A lot of the church leaders are teaching the rudiments of science and technology and the rudiments. The only institution that had any memory of the previous science and advances of civilization was church. So they're teaching this stuff, and you can. The second essay of Lord Acton is called The History of Freedom and Christianity. And actually, you had a power struggle between church and state, and that kept them from controlling the other. So it wasn't all idealistic, but the church was using biblical notions to teach about freedom so that the state wouldn't take over, and the state picked up on those notions and was using biblical notions of freedom so the church wouldn't take over. So they may not have been completely altruistic, but at least they're using the theory of God created man in his own image to rule, to tend the garden. He didn't create man to rule over other men. So you had this was being established in the Middle Ages, and so you had these idea of little city-state organizations, little republics. It wasn't perfectly and even in the feudal system, you had people who had a certain amount of self-rule within a certain. There was a move to abolish slavery within these what they refer to as Christendom, and so this doesn't jibe with what we've learned in history. Medieval time was time of the complete darkness. But actually, if you read Lord Acton's essay, The History of Freedom and Christianity, and he lays it all out in saying as they're coming up out of darkness, they're teaching these ideas, and the rudimentary ideas of Republican democracy were being taught. The rudimentary ideas that people should not be slaves based upon Augustine's idea were being taught. And as you come up into the Renaissance and people started to recapture non-filtered Platonism or Greek philosophy from supposedly from the Arabs, but actually the Arabs got it from the Eastern Christians. And so actually, in Eastern Christians fleeing Arab persecution was part of that. Then there was a lot of enlightenment going on because in terms of absorbing the Greek classics, but when it comes to human freedom, there wasn't much enlightenment going on. There's an idea in Plato called the guardians. You got a philosopher king. People should be ruled by a philosopher king, as opposed to people should rule themselves. This is not what Augustine was teaching, and it's not what the Middle Ages theoretically was trying to teach. So now you have you got a Christian civilization is being taught absolutist philosophy. Plato's Republic is, if you take it literally, is one of the most elaborate justifications for a tyrannical rule that you're ever going to find. Now, I find a lot of good in Plato, and there's a lot that I like and inspired by. But taken literally, Plato's Republic is the model for a tyrannical utopian society. And so you got these guardians who were born to rule. And you're going to educate them so that they can rule, and you're going to educate the other people so that they can be ruled, and you've got an education system that's going to keep everybody in their place. Some people picked up on this, and they referred to it as divine right of kings. So they gave it biblical trappings, and it says the kings had a lineal descent from Adam. And Adam had dominion not just over creation, but over Eve and his fellow human beings throughout perpetuity. And this right to dominion was inherited by the kings, monarchies. So you had an absolute divine right of kings. And so we're held together by this blood lineage from Adam, and the kings represent that authority. You're held together by authority and by lineage. And John Winthrop's, where he talks about we shall be a city on a hill, comes from that speech. He said, no, we're held together by love, not by force. And not even the force of reason, which is better than lineage and force and all stuff like that. Even the reason of an argument is not good enough. You need to create a society of love that will realize such attractive deeds and stuff like that. That'll become like a city on a hill and will attract other people. Now, this was his covenant that he's referring to, and this became the notion, we shall be a city on a hill. Later on, a more non-sectarian version of this, and I've already talked about this, is a new order for the ages. We're not going to be like the old order based upon blood or force or whatever, blood lineage or force or even law. So this was an ideal, and this was an ideal that the Quakers tried to put into place where you're going to have the inner light of God's dwelling within you, or Christ dwelling within you, the light of Christ within you, the hope and the glory. And you're going to have brotherly love among one another. You don't need a government. You're going to have this new covenant that Christ came to realize, where God writes his law on our hearts, should be happening now because Christ has already came quite a while ago. So they believe that. You don't need church. You don't need state in order to order society, because these are remnants of an order that was based upon force. So the Quakers created a holy experiment in Laissez-Faire, where they would create a society where they were run by the inner light within and brotherly love among one another. And that's where we got the name for the city of Philadelphia. I mean, it literally means brotherly love. And so you had this article that was, and this is where this laissez-faire means leave us alone. It's like, and there was an article on the internet called A Holy Experiment, Laissez-Faire, and they're talking about William Penn's colony. And they experimented with this notion of a covenant based upon love. They had, for a time being, because of their contract that they had created, it allowed them to have this territory. They had this contract William Penn bought the territory, and they were still under the king's dominion because this was prior to Revolution. And so they were forced to collect certain amount of taxes. Levy certain amount of taxes. So they only levied the taxes they were forced to. And even then, they didn't collect them. So, okay, you tell us to levy a tax, we'll levy it, but we're not going to collect it. So for all practical purposes, for a certain number of years, they were run by absolutely no government at all. It was total dominion of civil society. And they didn't have an actual church. They had a gathering where the people would gather together as in brotherly love, and they have these meetings where they would meet in silence and they would embrace one another. And maybe someone, if they felt inspired, would speak. They didn't have a preacher. They would give a sermon because that was a form of ruling that they didn't consider to be valid. And so this was an experiment that later inspired people like Jefferson and Locke and a bunch of the others who wrote. Locke wrote 2 treaties on government where he started explicitly, first treaty on government is writing against this patriarchal divine right of kings view that came from the guy named Sir Robert Fillmore. And or Jefferson's all men are created equal. These viewpoints could point to an experiment in order liberty where Philadelphia was a much younger than a lot of these other colonies, but they caught up to all the colonies except for Boston in terms of wealth and all these cultural amenities. They had probably the second best library and of all the colonies, second only to Boston. They had the best healthcare system, the best hospitals, and their education system was maybe second only to Boston. And they were a relatively new colony. Boston had been around for a long time. So you've seen how you could have a colony that was almost no government, that was totally run by the light of Christ within and brotherly love amongst. And it could, to a certain extent, work. Now, defending yourself from hostile Indians on the frontier might have been something they wanted to consider, but they didn't believe in defense. So eventually, more people come into the colonies kept pushing them, so they gave up rule because they refused to do that. They bought property from the Indians and negotiated, and they actually had a good relationship with the Indians. But over time, you have, people say, well, were the Indians friendly or hostile? Well, it depends, both. At sometimes they were hostile and we were hostile, and sometimes they're friendly and we were friendly, and within different groups you had different reactions. But the Quakers were one of the early ones who were actually, Jonathan Edwards was another one who believed that the Indians should be treated fairly because they weren't barbarians, they were human beings, and they had personhood. And so we should treat them the way with anyone else. And so they didn't, this brotherly love didn't extend to just people who were part of the same religion, because they believed they were very strong in their belief, the light of Christ and stuff like that. They weren't relativists, but they believed that this applied to everybody. And they believed that it was a blueprint for setting up society. And so to a certain extent it worked, but eventually it broke down because you needed to have a little bit of defense. Now, so that raises the question we have today. What is it that we are trying to conserve? Are we trying to conserve the dignity and freedom of the human person? If so, my contention is that conservatism is going off track, and we're spending more time fighting with political not allies. I wouldn't say opponents, but you have Democrats and Republicans, you have liberals and conservatives, and you have different viewpoints, and these are competitors, and competitors can make you stronger by iron sharpens iron, and you can compete with each other by which ideas are going to work better. But instead of promoting our ideas, it's like you have these warring factions, and it's not just conservatives. Left and right is the same thing. You got who's going to one up the other, who's going to, the politicians nowadays are. Popularity is based upon who's going to make war with the enemy the best, and then he's going to own the other side, and that's, unfortunately, we're going to go into some more detail of this problem in the future, and I'm going to talk about it from a conservative standpoint, but Sure, it is a problem of both left and right. So this has been the June edition of Operation City on a Hill, and I've been your host, Robert Maynard, and we will follow up with this series as we go on. Thank you very much, and have a nice night.